To myself, you know that.
Hello, everybody. This is Teresa Chan.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Charbonneau.
I'm Geoff Norman. Yes, indeed.
And welcome to the first ever Faculty Incubator Talk with the Experts. So Jonathan's going to take away from here, and I'm going to be asking some questions from off screen.
Thanks, everyone, for joining us. We have up to an hour, but I suspect that 40 minutes will be enough to accomplish a lot of the agenda we have. Many of you have been reading some of the articles this month on education theory and its application to us as clinician educators. We have with us a med-ed legend in the flesh. So Geoff, why don't you just give us a bit of a background and a bit of an origin story as to how did you become so prolific in education research, in curriculum design, and have such an influence on where we are as medical educators today?
Well, for openers, I had a mortgage to pay. I have a pretty checkered career in that I've been at McMaster for, I think, now 51 years. I predate the health sciences faculty. I predate the medical school because I came here to do research in nuclear physics, a PhD in nuclear physics in 1965. Eventually finished the PhD by the skin of my teeth because I was never terribly very good at it, truth be known. And then I was desperate for employment. And in those days, computers were physicists' playthings, so my supervisor made sure that we all knew about computers. And so I talked myself into a job running a computerized medical record system back in the days of punch cards and key punch operators and all sorts of stuff. We had like a staff of 6 just to run this thing for a little clinic.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Oh, stop it. And Teresa does, because she's very learned. Anyway, that lasted for a year, and then my supervisor decided to become a psychiatrist instead of a family doc, and I was desperate for a job, and I was talking to this internist one day at the clinic, and he was head of medical education. So that night I became a medical educator. It's not as if I ever dreamed about being one. It just happened, and literally it was to pay the mortgage. Or another line that I use routinely is that I left physics for reasons of ill health because I was starving to death. I did that for about 6 or 7 years. Basically what had happened is McMaster had a brand new medical school. It was all about problem-based learning and teaching problem-solving skills. That's an important underlying thing, teaching problem-solving skills, because that's no longer the way we talk about problem-based learning. But the idea was that expert clinicians had good problem-solving skills, but we had no idea what they were, so they hired me, God knows why, to find out about research on problem-solving skills. And so we did. We had simulated patients, and we stuffed doctors in the room with them and videotaped everything that moved and so on and so forth. And I did that for 6 or 7 years, and then hankering to be on faculty, I cut a deal with my boss to go off to Michigan State and get a master's in educational psychology, which was a fairly major turning point because that was the first time I had an academic exposure to education. And I think already you out there, and nameless and pictureless people out there, have recognized that there's a large gap between pop education, as is talked about in the corridors of academia, and serious educational research. I guess my adult learner paper that you've all been forced to read is an example of that. That you see that what people are saying and what is in fact the evidence really are somewhat dissociated. Anyway, so Michigan State taught me how to do statistics, and that led to a few books I've written on the subject and so on. But then the real turning point was when I came back and started schmoozing with the Department of Psychology here, and a guy named Lee Brooks, and you'll see his name on many of my papers. And McMaster was a hotbed for cognitive psychology, which only began about 1970 or so. And so I got in kind of on the ground floor and discovered that medicine was a great place to play cognitive psychology games because we didn't have to worry about artificial materials. We had real materials, and that forced relevance on us. And it turns out that some of the questions that they had theoretically were questions that had practical relevance to medical diagnosis. Medical diagnosis at the end of the day is a categorization task. Not, as it turns out, much different from deciding that something's a tree or a chihuahua or a Chevrolet or whatever. And the same kind of theories that were being used to talk about everyday categorization ended up being a very good fit with the theories about medical diagnostic categorization. And so that's kind of where my astonishing career took off from. Initially, I did a lot on assessment stuff, mainly because I was good at statistics. I had to carry something over from all that physics I was doing poorly at. But got frankly kind of bored with that. The one common denominator to the whole thing, and I think what's affected my career more than anything else, is that the physics was always a kind of a way of viewing the world. I was the kid who took the back off the alarm clock to see how it worked and never did manage to put it back together again, but never really cared. So, for example, I've never worried about practical relevance of what I was doing. I was always taking the hardline position that curiosity-oriented research historically has paid enormous dividends, far greater dividends than if you set out in the mission to, as Eisenhower did, if you remember that far back, the war on cancer, which frankly spent bazillions of dollars and led nowhere. So it's curiosity that's driven me. It's curiosity that keeps me around today at age 70-something. I'm not going to disclose what the something is. I'm here mostly because I still enjoy the research. Some of the research we're doing now is the most exciting I've ever done in my whole career. And that continues to be something that I just can't imagine life without it.
So Geoff, let me pick up a couple threads. It's obvious, and I did the math quick in my head. Thank God there's not a sample size calculation around it, but 65 to 2016, we're looking at 51 plus years. You're enthusiastic. You're still curious. And you talked about the frame or the lens or the way to see the world. And that's the description of a common theme, whether it's your physics graduate school training to the way you approach life as a medical educator today. We're talking this month around education theory. And so why education theory? Why is it important for a clinician to be grounded and understand the theory on which we stand?
First of all, there are really two kinds of education theory, and I think the distinction really matters. And what I talk about is theory-based research or theory testing research. Cook and Schmidt have talked about it in terms of description, justification, and application. No, not application. Anyway, let me unpack those. The basic idea is this: that in education, there are far too many theories, and adult learning theory exemplifies that, where essentially my paraphrase of somebody else is, education researchers often use theories the way a drunkard uses a lamppost, more for support than illumination. These are theories that are untested and are untestable, and there's lots of examples of that. Situated cognition, workplace-based assessment. All of these things sound good, but frankly, if you really explore and say what's going on here, there's no answer. The alternative is theory testing rather than theory-based research, theory testing research, which asks the why question. What's going on here? Why does it work this way? And that's why you went into physics. You know, one definition of physics was that if it had any practical application, it wasn't physics. So I've never worried too much about whether it was practical or not. Practical questions are rarely the kind of research questions that satisfy me. I really try to ask why questions and try to do tight experiments that really help us understand the nature of learning. And that represents only a subset of the kind of educational theories that frankly clutter up our world. And so the distinction of the kind of theories I'm talking about are theories that provide a basis and a framework for a research program. Actually, as a parenthetical side, health sciences research in general is kind of weird in that, as we know, the paragon of virtue is a randomized controlled trial. I find randomized controlled trials at best boring. They're mindless. I mean, just change the name of the drug and change the name of the condition, press find and replace on your computer, and you got the next randomized controlled trial. What really frustrates me about them is that often they're not based on a research program, that the program of research, the real understanding of research occurred back there in the pharmacology lab or the physiology lab. Clinicians come along and basically the question they ask is, does it work or doesn't it? Those are the kind of questions that are frankly no interest to me whatsoever. I don't care if it works, I want to know why it works. Because if it works is not generalizable. Why it works is generalizable. If it works is a technical question. I don't consider that even to be science. Science asks questions about how does the world work, and those are generalizable truths that emerge from that. You can perhaps accuse me right now of sounding a little pompous, but yeah, that's my worldview, and that's a worldview. The excitement of doing a study where not quite sure how it's going to come out, and I'm babbling, but forgive me. Come on.
Well, let me pick up some themes because I don't actually agree with your self-assessment. to the fullest extent. So some inflammatory statements there, which I would actually get behind. I know. In all the years I've known you, Geoff, never one to, you're always a gray. You're never a black or a white.
No, certainly not.
So you've made the argument that simple questions are of limited utility in the complexity. So simple controlled trials.
No, actually, no. I get that. I think that's, you don't mind if I interrupt, but I think that's not really what I was saying. I love simple experiments. I love simple, elegant. It is or it isn't. What
simplistic versus elegant.
Thank
that's
you.
I think
Thank
that's the distinction we're making.
Yeah.
So I would agree with that. So I want to, here's the line of questioning I want to take with you. You've talked about the concern with us asking questions of limited importance because they're easy to measure, rather than weighing into the more complex experimental designs that are the history of Hans Selye in psychology. And then not stopping once, but building out a program to analyze something bigger.
Yeah.
What would be an example from your career where over the period of numerous experiments over the span of time that you've been able to unpack or illuminate something? Because as much as you say that you're not concerned with the practicality, much of the findings of your programs of research have changed the way we have approached the practice of medical education. Can you put together an example?
Take a deep breath. Before we get there, I want to pick up on your point, because I think, again, you've misinterpreted me, and that's my fault. I'm not talking about elegant research designs or complex research designs or anything like that. Quite the opposite. The longer I play this game, the more I end up doing t-tests instead of multiple regressions. What I'm talking about is elegant questions. And the distinction where I come down heavy on the randomized controlled trial is the nature of the question, which is, does it work? Does it save lives? You know, count the bodies over here, count the bodies over there, it worked, it didn't work. The interesting scientific question, as I indicated earlier, occurred back in the pharmacology lab, where somebody played around with the molecules and the receptor sites and so on and so forth. And they knew that they were, at some level, it was working physiologically long before it got into the field. And so I remain interested in theory testing questions as opposed to practical questions, because practical questions, by their very nature, are limited in time and space. In our program, we did this, does it work? Unless you understand what were the active ingredients in that, then you're no further ahead. And in education, that's far more difficult than it is in clinical medicine, because in clinical medicine, you're down at the level of molecules and DNA and all that stuff. In education, you can't biopsy a mind, you can only biopsy a brain. And so making inferences about why does it work is much more complicated in education than it is in clinical medicine.
So picking up on the why does it work, can you tell us a little bit more about what are the programs of research that really kind of has clarified that why, so that we can understand that better?
It's hard for me to sort of say what are the big answers we now have, but I guess my whole research on clinical reasoning is, to paraphrase a guy named Price who wrote this book years ago, this is 5 decades of intermittently sustained research. It began, as indicated, with the research on problem-solving skills. And that's where the world was at, and sadly, that's where some of the world still is at. Let me be very clear. Problem-solving skills are dead meat.
Yeah.
Nothing gray about that.
Yeah. No, I agree with that.
Nothing generalizes. And we knew that in 1970-something, called content specificity. That is to say, however you did on one clinical problem had very little to do with how you did on the next clinical problem. Okay. That says that there's something else driving it. And the question was, what's the something else? Well, one of the studies I did back then to just explore that fairly simple question was to systematically vary the content, so that a group of residents saw standardized patients where half of them were from rheumatology and half from cardiology, and within the rheumatology, half of them were joint pain and half of them were knee pain and half of them were finger pain. And then within the finger pain, half of them were rheumatoid arthritis and so on and so forth. And then there were 2 patients that were the same condition, only different people. And what you found is that, in fact, there's limited, even with the same disease portrayed by 2 people, there's limited generalizability, suggesting that it's not even just content specificity, it's more specific than that. The other important piece was, I'm sure many of you have read about the hypothetical deductive method, or its current incarnation, dual processing, which says that docs, when they solve a clinical problem, typically have some hunches as to what's going on within a few seconds. You're all emergency physicians. I don't have to tell you that. That's not a revelation to you. You know that the actual data from Larry Gruppin is that 78% of the time the emergency doc has a diagnosis before he even sees the patient. Other studies we came across from the 70s saying Kundal and Nodine, radiologists looking at chest films for a fifth of a second, 200 milliseconds, have the diagnosis 70% of the time. No, sorry, can recognize abnormal or normal 70% of the time. That's an important distinction because they're seeing a pattern there that they can't even verbalize. They don't know the diagnosis, but they see the pattern. So the question then arises is, where are those hypotheses coming from? Because that seems to be the key to the process. I mean, our early studies showed that if you had the right hypothesis, you got the right diagnosis, and if you didn't, you didn't. Where are the hypotheses coming from? That's getting into really why questions about the nature of human memory. That leads, believe it or not, to things like neural networks, because there are a number of models kicking around about the nature of thinking. And the model that is the best fit, this goes back to psychology in the 70s or 80s, and it has predecessors called PDP models, associationist memory. These are all variations on a theme that basically says human memory works very, very different from computer memory. It's not a sequential search. It's not a sequential search through every nook and cranny. It's a massively parallel search, which has to deal with the fact that our neurons are talking to each other biochemically, which takes a lot longer than electronically. They're not moving at the speed of light. So in order to survive the world, we have evolutionarily created essentially a massive parallel processor. Simple example of that. Everybody, you ready? 2 quick questions for you. 1, 12 times 12 equals, John, what's the answer?
12 times 12?
Yeah.
144.
Good. It took a little longer than I'd expect. Teresa, you were there before he was. 17 times 17?
169. 169.
No, that's 13 times
13.
13. Okay, what happened there? And what's really important is what happened there.
Yeah.
The 12 times 12 you knew, and you knew instantly.
Yeah.
The 17 times 17, you knew you didn't know,
No, yeah.
and you knew that just as fast. In other words, you'd searched every nook and cranny and came up dry
And that,
in parallel in
Yeah.
the same time, and it took you to find the 12 times 12. I actually Googled 12 times 12. And Google took about the same time as you did, about a half a second. But Google had to search 25 billion websites to find it. Of course, Google also found 17 times 17 in the same period of time. Bottom line being that these kind of questions about where do hypotheses come from, and that was the way it was framed, starts leading down the path towards saying, so what is it about the nature of hypothesis generation? And that then leads, as you can tell now, these dual processing models, some of which I don't like very much, basically saying that they're really 2 fundamentally different kinds of processes. And collectively, we've shown, for example, that, well, we already showed that system 1, the fast process, is a major determinant of what happens. We've shown, we've essentially replicated studies in psychology showing that the system, what we're calling system 1 processing, is driven by prior experiences. So we do 2-stage experiments where, for example, in stage 1, I show you a bunch of cases. In stage 2, I then test you on a bunch of ambiguous cases, some of which bear superficial resemblance to those early cases. And I show that if you saw a middle-aged guy with chest pain who had a heart attack, you're more likely to call that ECG a heart attack than if you saw an 80-year-old woman with chest pain with a heart attack. So all of these things, I mean, this is a research program that really does extend 50 years, which began with, gee, problem solving isn't general. And it looks like it's hypothetical deductive, now down many years later to saying, okay, what is it the nature of the processing that's arising here to create these phenomena? And I don't have to tell you guys about John and Sherbino and I have been participating in a number of these recent experiments, and tomorrow or something we're going to be talking about the latest iteration. So that's sort of my one big massive research program.
Teresa, I know that for emergency physicians, clinical reasoning is going to light up Twitter.
Yeah.
Let's take one more follow-up question around clinical reasoning, and then we're going to change gears. Is there one that from your feed that you think is appropriate?
Yeah, so this was actually a pre-question that was submitted by Peek Mukherjee. He actually was very interested in this idea of the dual processing. And he wanted to know, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, how do you improve a learner's illness scripts? Does that involve encouraging them to do system 2 checks or not? How do we teach this? How do we teach
read
it?
the latest 2 papers. Actually, it's only on the weekend I was rewriting the section on how to teach clinical reasoning. First of all, as you know, in education, we define things without having, we can't put them under a microscope and see there's an illness script. I actually don't like the terminology of illness scripts because it to my mind, merges 2 fundamentally different ideas coming from psychology about the nature of categorization. One is called prototype theory, which basically says that every natural category is distinguished by essentially the examples you see of it create a prototype. So a prototypical bird is a robin. As it turns out, a prototypical vegetable is a carrot.
Mm-hmm.
And that prototype contains the defining features of the category. There's no simple rule that does it. There's no rule that makes something a chair or a bird. But the prototype theory, which bears a lot of resemblance to the illness script, is viewed as a summation of all of your experiences, a single entity that is a summation. The alternative is this exemplar theory that basically says those individual experiences still reside in memory, not in the original canonical form, but in some kind of representation so that I can show the linkage between a particular prior experience you've had and the current situation. So to me, the notion of refining illness scripts, how do you refine an illness script? To me, that's because you get more experiences, and so you have multiple illness scripts, if you like. And by the time you've got enough illness scripts, then you've got exemplars. What's clear from it, going back to your original question, though, is the idea that I can teach somebody some strategies to refine illness scripts or some strategies to do better dual processing. It's actually reverting back to the previous incarnation of general problem-solving skills. It's different language, but it's basically saying that there are fundamentally general strategies that you can learn that will help you. The current writing that is actually not available in press, is not available in print yet, but the review article that John and I worked on and a book chapter that I worked on about half an hour ago is both saying, no. The notion that there are general skills that we can somehow tune up to refine your illness scripts or to improve your system 2 processing or whatever, or to de-bias you is the other, of course, the hobby horse. I don't think that's valid. I think what you really have to say is that, and I think there's lots of evidence to suggest that it's knowledge-based processing that's driving it. That's what we meant by content specificity. We had a narrow definition of knowledge, but the fact of the matter is that what we're really saying is that you become an expert because an expert is somebody who knows an awful lot about what they're doing. Yeah.
So let me tie this thread or this bit of conversation. I would suggest that what I've heard is theory is fundamental to us as a clinician educator because it will give us direction as to where to attend and what to emphasize and what to invest in as educators. As an example, the 50-year span of work on clinical reasoning has led to hard outcomes for us as clinician educators and our perspective, and one that would be at odds with some of the general editorialization in emergency medicine and more broadly, is that teaching cognitive de-bias skills is a use of resources that's not going to give you a good return on investment. That you would want to direct the attention to increasing experience and exposure if you have a finite curriculum and a finite resource pool. So there is the application of theory, and that's why we need to understand how theory supports the education and curriculum decisions we make.
Yeah.
A fair summation?
Sure. And by analogy, everybody as a clinician, what happens in clinical medicine is essentially there's a dissociation between the trialists and so on, the people who are doing the human-oriented research, and the scientists who are doing it back in the lab. In education, those are brought together. But imagine a world where you only had the trialists. There were no pharmacologists, there were no physiologists, there were no anatomists. Basically, what you're talking about, I guess, is naturopathy, aren't you? Where we try this and we see if it works or not. And of course, 5% of the time, it'll be working at the 0.05 level, purely by chance. Essentially, what we're trying the best we can is to essentially recreate that kind of science which leads from the lab to the bedside, only in education. Education is sufficiently primitive that we can do that the same people can be doing both. The same people can be developing theories and testing. Whereas in medicine, there's been a real dissociation. The trialists, with few exceptions, don't understand the research, the fundamental wet lab research terribly well. There are some exceptions, of course. But in education, it's one and the same. It's driven by the same goals. So you have to understand the mechanisms before you can really build on anything.
Let's transition to advice to our faculty incubator participants. As a little side note, our camera is actually propped up on the PhD theses of some big names in medical education. I'm not going to reveal that, although if you follow my Twitter feed, you can probably read who they are later. So, standing on the shoulder of giants, if I was a clinician educator 3 years into practice, taking on a new job as an assistant program director, what advice would you give to me? Not the advice you suggested earlier, that a successful career in medical education requires the ability to smoke a pipe and drink scotch.
Well, that would be a guaranteed failure these days. Well, the scotch would still be okay. I can vouch for that from personal experience. When I got into the field, the roles were 180 degrees from what they are now. You have to recognize that the first generation of people, and I've written about this, but I'm not suggesting you go and read it. The first generation of us were a bunch of real misfits who came in. I mean, I wasn't a deviant. I was representative. I mean, we had Dave Irby, the theologian. We had Christine McGuire, who I think was an English major. A bunch of us oddbods who couldn't make an honest living in our discipline is what it came down to. And so we all retreaded, and we were, one way or another, taught very clearly that our role was that the clinicians provided the questions, and we had to learn the methodological skills to help them answer them. But that they were the leader of the team, and we were there to help and do the number crunching stuff. And that's clearly what my role was, because I didn't have, in fact, I couldn't even do the number crunching when I started in the game. I didn't know a t-test from an afternoon tea. That has changed. The field has matured enormously. As a consequence, the clinician, as you describe them, if you want to become an education researcher, I think the reality is that you can't do it on your own. You have to become a member of a team. And in particular, back then, a practical question was a research question, was a practical question, was a research question. And many of the papers started with something like, at the University of Podunk, we had this problem with, and here's what we did about it. That becomes a caricature now in the journal I edit. As soon as we see a paper that starts with, at the University of Podunk, it's sent back. It doesn't make it to peer review. What that reflects is the field has matured. The field has now a corpus of theory to draw on. And it's a tough game. I mean, I'm sorry, there's no illusions here. At medical education, the acceptance rate is 5%. At advances in health sciences education, it's about 13%. Academic medicine is somewhere in the middle. And more particularly, certainly half the papers we turned down are turned down not because they weren't methodologically rigorous, but because they were nothing new. What that means is that the investigators didn't understand the literature well enough to recognize what the real questions were that were going to advance the field, and they just answered one that we already knew an answer for. So the reality is that although as a clinician investigator you have a fundamental role in terms of helping me, after all, at the end of the day, I still have to be true to the clinical environment. I still have to be able to ask the right questions. And I can, all of my knowledge of medicine is derived from watching ER, watching St. Elsewhere, and having my gallbladder out 2 years ago. That's it, folks. The rest of it I have to imagine. And sometimes my imaginations are completely off the wall. And so we work together as collaborators, as a team, to first of all, take your practical questions and poke them and prod them until they're research questions. And secondly, take my research questions and poke them and prod them to the point that they have some validity in the real world that you work in. And to be honest, that's cool, because the two people in the room with me and we are equals, and we're collaborators, and we're having a ball. And in a sense, this mature field that we play in has given us all very valid and useful roles. And we have fun together.
So Geoff, I think you're being a little modest. We've done enough trials together that your knowledge of medicine is enough that I'd let you take the wheel as an intern. I'll let you see the patients. Maybe Maybe not do the intubation, but
but just don't let me do immunology. Okay?
Emergency medicine is, I think, where we're going to put you. Collaboration, I think, is a really essential element, and that's something that you have mentored for me, and I think that's a message that our incubatees should really be attentive to. Collaboration amongst other clinician educators, but collaboration with the cognitive psychologists, the educationalists, the PhD researchers, the education scientists in your community. And if you were at any kind of academic institution and affiliation with your teaching hospital, I can guarantee there's people who are wrestling with that same question.
There's another side of that which I should have brought up, and that is that this is going to enrich your role as an education leader as well. As you've already figured out with the paper you had to read, there's a lot of mythology out there. I can give you a laundry list of things like self-assessment skills, learning styles, critical thinking. There's a lot of stuff. Multitasking. Oh yeah, multitasking. The new generation, the millennium generation that can multitask. No, they can't. They can task switch. That's, after all, the brain has evolved at a glacial pace, not in one generation. What they're doing is task switching to their cost. Bottom line being, there's an awful lot of mythology out there. By becoming more in tune with this literature, the scientific literature on education, by definition, that's going to make you a better educational leader. Because you're not going to be sideswiped and blindsided by some of the silliness that's out there. Well, don't get me started. I can draw up a long laundry list. I did once, of all the mythologies that are simply dead wrong, and we've known them dead wrong for a long time, but they still live on. It would be folly for you as an educator to fall for some of that stuff. You're wasting your time and everybody else's.
Teresa, I want to go to Twitter for a second. Picking up this theme on advice to an early career clinician educator, I have a couple things that popped up on my feed this morning, but anything that comes from you that you want to throw to Geoff?
Yeah, so one of our faculty incubator participants, Emily Rose, asked a question actually last night in preparation for this. And she asks, how do you create discipline for time? And I think to write, to dedicate to these kind of tasks. I think that we've actually had some discussions with a lot of the incubator participants, and they've been having trouble with finding the time to write. Now, I know it's very different when you don't have your distracting night job, I guess we could call it, Jonathan, where you have to go and do clinical work as well, and then the administrative duties that a lot of our participants have competing. But do you have any suggestions for, how do you get in the zone? How do you sit down and write?
I think you guys are probably better able to answer that than I am. It's a lot more fun being a voyeur of medical education than having to be a medical educator like you people out there. One of the many problems I think with health sciences research is that the rhetoric, the underlying, the hidden curriculum, if you like, of research in health sciences is that any doctor can do it, but you can only do it on Saturday mornings and evenings. And you don't need any specialized knowledge or disciplinary knowledge. You don't have to go back and retrain because, after all, MD gives you all the credentials you need. All of this is, of course, nonsense as soon as I frame it that way. But one of the difficulties that you have, even if you're not seduced by that kind of nonsense, is that God help you guys. You've got 60 hours a week that's structured for you, where people are making demands on you beginning to end. Whereas I can sit back and think deep thoughts for 40 hours a week and nobody complains. So my job is a hell of a lot easier than yours. Having said that, our Associate Dean of Research years ago was at a little family medicine retreat, and he said a line which has carried me through ever since. He said, research is like acting. You do it because you can't help yourself. I never have to sort of put my life on hold to go and write a paper. It's never drudgery. It's quite the opposite. When I'm writing a paper, nothing stands in my way. Everything else goes down the toilet because I'm writing the paper. And I do it because it's just such a passion. It's such an all-devouring thing. Now, part of that says that it's not mundane papers. It's the curiosity that goes into trying to reframe and think this stuff through. Some poor souls do Sudoku and crossword puzzles. I get to get paid an obscene amount of money to do Sudoku and crossword puzzles that actually mean something in the end, and in some little tiny way make the world a better place. But it's not because of, unlike you guys, who are motivated to truly help. I mean, I hold physicians in high respect. Your altruism is astonishing to me. I was always far too selfish for that. So I get to play the curiosity game. I get to get the kind of intellectual satisfaction from solving these puzzles, and I get to be paid enormously for it. I don't know how you get to the point where you have the excitement that I did. I don't think it's genetic. My father sold insurance, and my mother worked in the warehouse district, so that didn't explain it. But I am at the stage where I do it because I can't help myself. It's absolutely front and center. It's a passion. It's an addiction.
I would say that you used one of the words I hate the most, which is the word passion. I think it's oversubscribed and overused, but you unpacked it really nicely for me, and I think for our audience. You talked about a developing interest, which I think our incubatees have shown, that with increasing knowledge and understanding, there comes some degree of drilling down into what's meaningful. And then as you start to contribute to it, you start to see wins and influence in how you're changing it. When you combine those attributes together, yeah, I guess you can call it passion, but I always hate that word. But, but I know exactly, we've had many conversations where we've been really excited by questions, some of them which have fizzled on us, and others which have really led to a rethinking or a new insight into where to go next. I want to ask a question that I think I struggle with often. I know that it was something that one of the incubatees reached out to me is, what kind of advice would you give to a clinician educator who walks around with an imposter syndrome? A feeling that if someone were to ask them just the right question, the house of cards, the so-called house of cards, would suddenly fall apart.
Well, interesting you should mention that, because I guess it's too strong to say I nearly quit the field, but I nearly quit doing any kind of public speaking about 20 years ago, because I discovered one night at a little conference that, again, I hadn't slept the night before because I was doing a talk the next day, and I hadn't slept at all. And I came down bleary-eyed, and I sort of said to myself, if I don't get this under control, I'm going to be in serious trouble. I'm going to have to stop going on the road and doing lectures. And it was a psychiatry conference, and the psychiatrist said, you're suffering from the imposter syndrome. So to me, imposter syndrome is self-imposed, if you like. It's an intra-psychic phenomenon. And it's something which I don't lose as much sleep as I used to, but I still lose sleep the night before. Last week there were 2 tough talks to unfamiliar audiences, and both times I didn't sleep very well. And for a long, long time, I suffered from the imposter syndrome because I had lots of reasons to suffer from the imposter syndrome. I was an imposter. Hell, the first 15 years I was faking it. So nothing new. But the question you're arising is different. Is these people who, the way I characterize it is, say somebody will babble off polysyllabic words, and I'm asking myself, is this guy profound or is he simply obscure? And how can I tell? I think, as you can imagine, in my role, people ask me my opinion on this, that, and the other thing all the time. And I never begin a sentence with, well, in my opinion. I always begin a sentence with either the evidence is or I have no opinion. And I think that's the power that comes from understanding this or any literature, is that you can go to the evidence and say, this isn't my perspective on the world. This is my best guess is what the world is telling me. And so, I would have no trouble defrocking the imposters, because I can ask them the right questions to say, what's the evidence for that assertion, Dr. Jones?
Right. Teresa, I want to get one more question from Twitter, and then we're going to wrap up with a series of 3 rapid-fire questions.
Oh, God. Okay. I don't think fast anymore.
I think while we're on the kind of like the closing part, Emily also asked a great question I think I'd love to hear your answer to. What is a research question that you would like to see answered? Regarding the future of medical education.
Yeah, I know you're going to go to the future. Yeah. That's one. You don't like passion. I don't like the future of.
I do.
In fact, I'm just reading a book last night about people's predictions, and how we're totally seduced by people's predicting the future, and they're always wrong. They're always wrong.
Yeah.
Lord Kelvin said, aircraft flying will never be practical. 5 years later, it was.
Who needs a computer in everyone's home, right? Isn't that the head of IBM?
Yeah, right.
I think the question more stems from the idea of, if you were getting into this field right now, what are some areas that we should go poking around at?
I will not engage with you. Sorry.
Okay.
Because, first of all, the nature of a research program is that it's stepwise, it's incremental.
Yeah.
And so what interests me today is the question for the next 2 months.
Mm-hmm.
And then 2 months from now, I know Ma Nature is going to provide me with some hunches. And Ma Nature is funny in that if you're doing your job well, you'll always get to answer your primary question.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at it really, really closely, there'll be something she's trying to tell you.
Mm-hmm.
And that'll lead you down the next pathway.
Mm-hmm.
And so don't ask me what's going to be like 20 years from now. I will not engage in futurology.
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, I have such a I've just lost the words. I have such a narrowly defined interest because I like to go deep.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm kind of the wrong person to ask for the big picture stuff anyway. Mm-hmm. So it's a question that you come to the wrong guy. Mm-hmm. A guy named, a statistician called Fred Mosteller said, while the data speak for themselves, their voices are really quiet and you have to listen really carefully. And honestly, there's two glorious kicks out of this. There's a few glorious kicks. The one is, I enjoy the roar of the grease paint, the smell of the crowd. I like to give a talk to 200 people in the university somewhere and everybody applauds and it's great. I love that. But the other thing I really love is to be all alone in my office with my computer and SPSS up on the screen and playing around with the data to see what stories Ma Nature's got up her sleeve this time. And so to me, there is no big question. There's just the next question and the question after that and the question after that.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so we're going to end with a rapid fire round. So the questions are rapid. The answers can be as long as you want, okay?
Okay, all right.
The battery life on the computer, though, is
right,
such. Okay, so a milestone in your career.
Michigan State, 1976-77. That's, first of all, as I already told you, it was amateur hour. I was an imposter. I learned two things from that. One is Michigan State in education was absolutely the center of the universe at that point. Lee Shulman, who some of you may know, went on to be president of the Carnegie Foundation, taught me the course on theories of learning. Okay, and Elstein of the Shulman-Elstein Grafka, he was my supervisor on my thesis. But I also learned statistics there by a guy named Andy Porter, who taught me to love statistics. I mean, that sounds pretty weird. That's like loving a massacre.
I think that ship has sailed, okay?
I think so. I was taught a love of statistics. It was taught in a coherent, fun fashion. It's led to me writing a few statistics books that have been all, frankly, bestsellers. I also was taught a love of education, because hear from very, very smart people. Up until that point, it felt like market research. But to be honest, that's because I wasn't doing it very well. But here's some very smart people who are engaged in it and who are really thoughtfully engaged in it and thinking deeply about what the nature of learning was. And so that was that was a turning point in the career. And I came back with credentials and something to build on.
That's interesting. So I had no idea how you're going to answer that question. It's interesting to me that a milestone in your career was being introduced to a new community who had a profound influence on where your career went.
Yeah.
That's all right. Question number 2. If you had a billboard anywhere that could say anything, what would you have on the billboard and where would you put it?
It would be a quote from a woman named Mary Budd Rowe, professor of science education at Stanford, who said, and I think this captures it so well, "Science is a special kind of storytelling with no right or wrong answers, just better and better stories." What makes that wonderful is because far too often, the original article in particular, the original paper, is frankly boring. The real challenge in doing good science is to use your data to inform the story you're telling and to reframe it as a story. One of the things I have to teach graduate students is you don't write the results section in the order it came off SPSS. You say, what are the real questions here? What is this data telling me? And then you build the story around that. I was taught by other people that one of the things that is really important in writing a paper is coming up with the title. And, you know, a couple of days ago, I was looking at a bunch of journals. Every bloody paper has a colon in it. Do you know why that's the case? Because somebody somewhere proved that if you had a colon in your title, you had a 5% greater chance of being accepted. So every bloody paper has a colon in it. Honestly.
We need to reframe some of our titles.
Well, here's a couple of my favorite titles. One was about showing that virtual reality simulations for learning anatomy had no advantage over just front and back views. The real virtue of virtual reality. I kind of like that. But my favorite, and the one that got me into BMJ unquestionably, was the title. It was a paper that was published about 3 years ago on sample size calculations. By the way, sample size calculations is as close to alchemy as you can get. I'll make a deal. Anytime you want a sample size calculation done, tell me what the sample size is you want, and I'll get it for you. Because I can easily diddle things to make it happen. Don't worry about it. But, so the basic argument was, don't bother going after your statistician, paying him obscene amounts of money to tell you you need 43 per group. Instead, look at what people are using in that field. And, you know, when you're doing this kind of research, 30 per group seems to be about right. When you're doing that kind of research, it seems to be about 100 per group. And so the title of the paper, which occurred to me as many things do at 4 a.m., was Sample Size Estimation. Should the emperor's clothes be off the rack or made to measure? But I even refined it because I thought maybe the Brits don't use the term off the rack. So I talked to a British friend, and it turns out in Britain it's off the peg. And so that's what the title is. Mm-hmm. All of those says it's a special kind of storytelling. And that leads to the idea of programmatic research. It leads to the kind of joy of telling a better story. And it moves you beyond saying, this one was bigger than that one, p less than 0.05, to saying, why was it bigger? What's going on here?
All right, we're going to close with this final kind of rapid round question. If you're going to invite, so this is not mandatory, you don't have to listen to what Geoff says next, but if you're going to tell our incubatees to read one book and to read one paper, what's the book, what's the paper?
Actually, the book is easy. This was a life-changing event too. I was in South Africa in 2000 and staying sort of with a friend of a friend, and his son said, read this book. A guy named Steven Pinker, who's a Harvard psychologist but born in Montreal, and he wrote a book called How the Mind Works, and it changed my world.
Right.
It was a totally engaging overview of cognitive psychology. Totally engaging.
I'm picking that up. I haven't read that one yet. I'm surprised you haven't pushed it on me, so I'm going to go pick that up. Right? And the paper?
Jesus. That's harder. Oh, yes. Well, the one paper is Disciplines of Inquiry in Education. It's an ancient paper by Lee Shulman, which talks about how education isn't a discipline unto itself. Rather, it's a sandbox that various disciplines can play in. That really plays to the current issues around qualitative versus quantitative and all that stuff. That was a classic paper. Another classic paper is a lot denser than that. The name Lee Cronbach, you may have heard of through Cronbach's Alpha. But it's called The Two Disciplines of Scientific Psychology. Being from Cronbach, it's incredibly opaque. But somebody named Norman has written a couple of Cronbach for Dummies papers. What he's really arguing is that there's two kinds of psychologists out there, but there's also two kinds of clinical researchers I'll get to in a second. One is the experimentalists, who essentially work with their rats and their pigeons in the lab. And to them, individual differences is anathema. Whether it's first-year psychology students, hopefully they're genetically identical rats or genetically identical pigeons, or in fact, genetically identical first-year psychology students. Harder to come by. But individual aspects is not something they care about. No cognitive psychologist looks at the GPA of the students in his first-year class. He could care less. All they're interested in is the experiment, and to them, individual variation is noise. It is literally in the t-test, in the denominator of the t-test. And then there's the correlation ones, the people who measure IQ, the people who look at developmental stuff, the people who look at personality. To them, individual variation is everything. And so it was literally the case that these two groups, one person's signal is the other person's noise. And they go to different meetings, they publish in different papers, and you say to yourself, and what does that have to do with my world? Well, I'm still in an epidemiology department. Our bad actors, the bad guys across the street were the classical public health epidemiologists. We're the clinical epidemiologists. We do experiments, and randomized controlled trials are the greatest form of truth, beauty, and wisdom, second only to E equals MC squared, right? Think about it for a second. Clinical epidemiologists are experimentalists. They do their darndest to get rid of individual variation with their pages and pages of inclusion and exclusion criteria. The classical epidemiologists trying to understand the determinants of Zeta virus outbreaks, the determinants of epidemics in general, risk factors for chronic diseases, prognosis for cancer, individual variation is everything. If everybody had the same if everybody's breast cancer came in at exactly the same stage with exactly the same kind of cells, you wouldn't be looking at risk factors. So those two groups continue to talk past each other, and as the clinicians out there are well aware, you've been sold, frankly, say it, a bill of goods from McMaster about the randomized controlled trial is the highest thing on the totem pole. Only if you're doing experimental research. We're still waiting for the randomized controlled trial of smoking. Why? Because that's an observational study and legitimate in its own right. Take that under advisement and say, gee, this is a bigger worldview than the one I've been using.
Geoff, we're going to ask Teresa any final comments before we sign out.
I think we're pretty much good. I think most of the questions that people have been asking have been answered in some way. So.
Geoff, before we end, and just so that I'm tenured, so I'm okay. You're emeritus, so you're okay.
Oh, I'm really okay.
Any last words that you want to share so that we don't end on the McMaster smoking gun theory?
Okay. It's really picking up on our associate dean research. This is so much fun that if it's not feeling like fun, you're not doing it right. It's something that you do because you can't help yourself. That's why I'm still doing it. Many people have said, how do you remain enthusiastic in this? Because getting the answer to those kind of questions is really, really, really exciting.
Great. I can't imagine a better way to end than that. I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank the Incubatees for submitting their questions. I guess with that, if you have further questions, we will have a conversation on Slack where we can pick up these themes. I'd invite you to think about that today. If you're not having fun, you're not doing it right. Take care.
Okay. Bye, guys.